Good evening. I'm Oshia Boyd, Public Engagement Editor at the Indy Star. October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. We've come a long way in education and removing stigma regarding domestic violence since the first Domestic Violence Awareness Month in 1987. But we still have much more to do, especially after shelter-in-place order caused by COVID-19. In 2018, Indianapolis Police Department, Metropolitan Police Department, IMPD, received 11,609 calls for domestic-related incidents. That number increased to 18,677 in 2019. That number increased astronomically in 2020 to 30,788. The number of deaths from domestic violence increased 180% in Indiana since the pandemic, and guns were used in 90% of domestic violence related deaths this year. According to data from the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, 42.5% of women and 27.9% of men in Indiana experience intimate partner violence, sexual violence, or stalking at some point in their lives. We have a lot to discuss here. Joining me for tonight's conversation are Kelly McBride, Executive Director of Domestic Violence Network.
Thanks for having me.
Jamie Schnurple, Director of Programs and Survival Services at the Julian Center, and Monica Connolly, a survivor of domestic violence. Welcome, ladies.
Thank you.
It is a pleasure to have you here. I won't say this topic is pleasant, but it's important, vitally important. So Jamie, I'll start with you. Let's talk about the language surrounding domestic violence. We want to make sure that we're all on the same page, and let's get a clear understanding on the definition. What is domestic violence, and does it look different in different cultures or socioeconomic groups?
So I'm glad that you started with this because I think there's a lot of confusion around what domestic violence is, and I always stress that at the core of domestic violence, it's about coercion and control and manipulation of one person over another, and that type of control can manifest in very many ways. There's the sort of most obvious, and that's what people think of, right? The physical act. So there's a physical violence. There's, it conjures up that old age picture of a black eye, that kind of stuff. But in fact, it goes deeper than that. There is emotional abuse. There is verbal abuse. And one that is often kind of overlooked is financial abuse. It's that sense of somebody controlling all of the finances. Maybe it's salary, maybe it's the ability to earn money. So it kind of runs the gamut. At the heart of it, though, is that sense of a controlling relationship. Typically speaking, when we in the service area are looking at domestic violence, we're talking about a relationship that has an intimate component. It can be a husband and wife. It can be a boyfriend and girlfriend. It can be a girlfriend and girlfriend. It can be two wives. It can be a dating relationship. But typically there is an intimate relationship there. And it's tough because you want to make sure that everybody is on the same page and has the same understanding, but again, it does vary. But fundamentally, again, it's about control over another person, and that control can manifest in different ways.
Thank you for that, because I think we don't think about all those ways, especially finance, emotion. I mean, things that don't have to show up on the person's body.
Sure.
And that's a big deal.
Yes, it is. And all of it ultimately leads to an isolation from other people, whether it's friends and family or neighbors, right? There is this this sort of way of keeping somebody from seeking help. And we'll talk a little bit later about things to look for, kind of red flags, if you will. You did ask about different socioeconomic groups, different communities, different ethnic groups. One of the things I say about domestic violence is it does not discriminate. It is everywhere. It doesn't matter if you have all the money in the world or don't have any money. It doesn't discriminate. But sometimes what we find is in different communities, it is more challenging to reach survivors, and perhaps more challenging for those survivors to reach us, particularly when you're talking about different areas where culture and religion have really deep ties. There is still a sense or a belief of this is what happens in the home, and what happens in the home is private, and we don't talk about it. What we see in Indianapolis especially is how tight-knit some of our immigrant populations are, where it's not even a 6 degree of separation. It's if I go and I seek help from an agency where maybe they speak my language, that person might know my parent, might know my spouse, etc. So depending on the community that you're in, it's challenging to kind of get through to some of the survivors, and likewise for them to come out and seek help. The reality also is that sometimes people don't know that they're in the situation that they're in. They don't know that there is such a thing as marital rape. And talking about those definitions and talking about those types of abuse is critical to make sure we're communicating that out.
Especially if they think it's normal in their communities.
Yes, yeah. And a lot of, we've had a lot of cases where we've had, one-on-one education with survivors who come in, and there is this moment of, I didn't realize that, or it's taken me a long time to figure that out. This is what my grandparents did. This is what my parents did. This is how my church sees acceptable behavior and partnership. So it can be challenging for sure.
Thank you.
Sure.
Monica, domestic violence isn't just data and numbers. This is real for you. Can you share your story?
Yes. I was married. Very soon after being married, my situation got really bad. I realized I was in an abusive relationship and I got out. So a few months after being married, I filed for divorce. I filed for protective order, called the police several times. The system kind of just failed me, and events led up to me shooting and killing my ex-husband.
Wow. And how long after? So how did things escalate to that point?
That's a good question. I really don't know. They just didn't stop. I know that once I filed for divorce, things got worse than before I had filed for divorce. Once my divorce was granted and finalized, I thought that would be the end of it. Things got extremely worse at that point. And there were a lot of police calls. There was a lot of fighting. There was just a ton of abuse, and he showed up in my house one night. He was there.
He just appeared in your house, right?
Yeah. I stepped out of my bedroom closet and he was standing there in my doorway.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Kelly, Monica got a restraining order. Things got worse after divorce. Police were called. Police reports show he was accused of harassment, theft, and intimidation. She did what she's supposed to do, but it wasn't enough. Why is that? And we often hear that ending a relationship or leaving is the most dangerous time. Why?
Yes, absolutely. It is the most dangerous time. We know that your chances of lethality increase by 75% once you exit a domestic violence relationship. And as Jamie talked about earlier, domestic violence is about power and control. What is the ultimate power and control? Is taking someone's life. So if someone is trying to exit that relationship, the other person feels like they're losing all their power and control. That is one way they feel like they can get it back. The other thing is when you, especially with like murder suicides, if they feel like there's nothing they have to lose, they could potentially kill their partner and anyone else around. So it is really important to work with an advocate when you're leaving a relationship for safety planning reasons, that sort of thing. We want to make sure that as you're leaving, you're as safe as possible. Make sure you have all your documents in place. You're speaking with an advocate. You have a safety plan. You know what to do. And yeah, so there's a number of reasons, but that would be the main one of.
Well, and that's, you spoke of having an advocate and a safety plan. That takes preparation and thinking ahead.
It does. And sometimes you don't have that. Sometimes you just walk out the door and that's all you have. And I've worked with clients who said, I have a 2-hour window. He is going to be wherever at work in these 2 hours, and that's all the time I have to get out. There's not time to do any of that stuff. You pack as much, you get your bags, you get your paperwork, you get out. We get you into a hotel room or whatever we need to do to get you safe. So you don't always have that opportunity. But as soon as you do, please reach out to an advocate, absolutely, because that is the most dangerous time. I sit on the domestic violence fatality review team. Every single person who has been murdered has been exiting a domestic violence relationship. So it's very important to work with someone. And in Monica's case too, oh, Monica, that could have turned out so different. He showed up at your house. That's a prime example of the escalation and showing up and just breaking down the door. I'm going to show you I have the power.
I will say too, if you don't mind me.
Oh, please.
Yes, sometimes it does take preparation and it takes forethought, and sometimes we don't have that, we're all saying. But I will say that we have worked with folks who have called us and said, okay, he's gone now. I can get out right now and
Wow.
call the crisis line. I can give that to you in a little bit. Call 911, ask to speak with somebody from victim assistance. The benefit is that there are so many different agencies out there, and we'll do what we need to do to get you to a safe place. We'll do what we can. I think that if we are using as many tools as possible, that is going to be the way we're going to affect change, and we're going to lower these numbers, and we're going to help more people, and we're going to avoid situations like Monica was in, or any of the other individuals who represent all the statistics that we're talking about. Because really at the end of the day, that's what we all wanted to do, is to provide some level of help and bring in as much as we can to get that help to the individuals.
Thank you. So I'm glad that you started answering the question, Jamie, because my next question is for you.
Oh.
So what has happened since the pandemic? The data is pretty daunting.
Yes.
According to the Indiana Coalition Against Domestic Violence, 77 people died from domestic violence from July 2021 to June of this year, and 98 people died from June 2020 to July 2021. What are organizations such as yours finding are the reasons for the increase, or are you finding there's any reasons? Or
So, the reality, and I talked about this all throughout the pandemic, and I believe we talked about it last time too. When we had the shelter-in-place orders come out, or the isolation orders come out, all of us on the victim services side kind of cringed, right? Because for a lot of us, sheltering in place was a bit of an inconvenience. Our kids are learning from school, or learning school at home. We're having to work at home, all these things. But it was nothing compared to somebody being told, okay, you can't go to work, your abuser can't go to work, your children aren't going to school. By the way, you lost your job because restaurants had to close and stores had to close and businesses had to scale back. So what we're seeing is a little bit of the burst of that bubble. We're looking at a long period of time where we've had survivors with limited access to resources, despite being as creative as we all possibly could have been. On top of, then they're stuck at home with their abusers, so there's really not any of that built-in break, if you will, in the day. And then on top of that, all the other stressors of life. And so you've got all of these intersectionalities between loss of income, loss of education, loss of housing, and then, by the way, you can't go anywhere. So what we're seeing, frankly, is the fallout from that we all were kind of holding our breath, awaiting. And like anything, when you are increasing the pressure on something, the explosion, if you will, is going to be bigger. And so we're seeing that. We're seeing the fallout from that. We're seeing we are seeing higher lethality. We're seeing higher risk. We're seeing an increase in calls because now people are able to tell us about what's gone on and what's happened behind closed doors, literally out of sight. And so that's really what we're seeing the response of.
Yeah, I think that COVID didn't help my situation either. I know that there were several times that I called the police during COVID and they just refused to come out. They would take a report over the phone. My abuser continuously harassed me, and the prosecutor's office were filing motions to revoke his bond initially, and the court wouldn't even bring him into custody because it was COVID. So I also think that, just like Jamie said, there was just a lead up and a build up of things that I think, quite frankly, pissed him off and made situations, it made it worse for me once he was released from jail.
And is this common? Were you hearing about stories like this where police weren't coming out or they weren't bringing them into custody or anything because of COVID? People, I mean, there was a while where people were afraid to, what are we supposed to do here?
I haven't had direct reports of police not showing up, but what I can say is the court's closed for a really long time.
Yes.
And the way protective order hearings were held and criminal hearings were held were very different. And I think coming on the heels of all of this, that there was a slowdown and there was a sense of, okay, how do we operate in this now, right? We're being told all of these different ways, and I'm certainly not trying to shirk responsibility or dismiss anything that you said. Please do not take it that way. I think it's just a matter of, like, how do we do it? Literally, how do we do it? And so we have heard reports of cases not being heard in what historically would have been a way better time frame, and a little bit of a lag there because of the lack of ability to be in person. Kelly, did you?
Yeah, I guess I would like to say too that domestic violence existed before COVID.
Sure.
It just, the levels rose.
Yeah.
And I want to make that clear. COVID didn't cause domestic violence.
No.
And when we had a 200% increase, and I'm not saying you did say that, I'm just clarifying. But we had a 200% increase to IMPD during that time. That's a huge increase, and I mean, those individual folks, like Jamie said, were stuck literally at home with their abusers.
Yeah.
And the tensions and all of the challenges of COVID came down on them.
Yeah.
And I think couples that maybe were facing domestic violence still, but maybe a lower level of domestic violence, if you are now seeing a higher level, and we're seeing
of the exacerbated stress.
Exactly. We're seeing more strangulation. We're seeing more weapons used. We're seeing, as James said, more lethality. So that's just important to note that we're not quite at those levels anymore. I mean, our homicide did come down. Even one murder is too many, right? I want to make that clear. But we are seeing it come down a bit, but we're still seeing the after effects of it as well.
Well, and I think as we do pandemic planning, because that's a part of our world today.
Yeah.
Right.
There's pandemic handbooks. So I think as we do part of the planning, this has to be a part of the planning.
Yeah.
Because I don't know that someone thought of this or would have thought of this had we not had this discussion today, because I don't know, I know we missed a lot of things in the plan in trying to figure out how to keep people from getting sick. I know there were so many things you're like, oh, I didn't think about that. I didn't think about that. So hopefully now the powers that be, whoever is planning the pandemic handbook out there, will add this piece to this, because it's a much needed piece to keep people safe.
I agree, and I think that the conversations, at least that I've been a part of, are broader now. I think that the acknowledgement that there are so many other facets of this that maybe we didn't realize intersected. You know, maybe we were like, well, I'm a victim services provider and this is what I do. But then there's also the crossover, if you will, with all of these other agencies and all of these other service providers. And part of it is the Department of Health and, you know, all of these different health side providers as well, hospitals, et cetera. So I'm cautiously optimistic that we're moving in the right direction in terms of the types of conversations that we're having.
Monica, when we talked earlier, you mentioned shame. There's a stigma around domestic violence. That feeling comes up often in domestic violence situations. What can we as friends and family do to make it easier to talk about it and remove that stigma and shame?
I think that friends and family need to be just a little more understanding. And part of that understanding is an understanding that you don't know the full story. I know that personally for me, I had some friends and family that knew that I was in an abusive relationship, but they didn't know the extent of it. And then my abuser would come and do all these wonderful things, and he bought me a purse, and he's brought me a bag and flowers, and I heard so many times, oh, he's trying. And I can remember telling family and friends, I'm really trying to get out of this situation. Maybe it doesn't look like that to you, but I am trying to get out. And I think that people just really didn't understand that. So I think that you just have to, I think it comes down to, if you see somebody in a situation or being abused even once, that's enough. And you just have to be firm on that and say at one time, and that was it, that's enough. And I'm gonna support you in whatever it is that you need to get away.
You said a couple things that are key. You said didn't know the extent of it. Why does there have to be an extent of it? Like you said, one time, once is enough. Why does it have to be, oh, if he's not doing this, or that, or the person is not doing this, or that, then it's okay. And so I want to kind of talk about that, but I'm going to pivot to you as well, Kelly, to ask you a question about this, so we can just kind of have a deeper conversation. We just heard words matter. The way we talk about domestic violence can cause harm, often unintentionally. We know domestic violence exists, so why are conversations about it so difficult? Why do we say things like, well, we didn't know it was that bad? Well, why don't you just leave? You know, if it was that bad, why don't you just leave? Those things are still said, and how does that hurt, hinder, make someone afraid to leave? What happens when you hear those things?
Yeah, I think those are great questions, and the onus needs to be put on the person who's causing the harm, not the victim, right? So words matter. They matter a great deal. They're very, very important, and they can hurt or harm anyone. So when we're speaking about domestic violence, we want to make sure that we are compassionate, we are non-judgmental. I hear people say, well, if it were me, well, but it's not you. So let's step back for a second, right? And like, this is this person's life. This person loves the person who's causing them harm. We have to keep that in mind. It was not always awful, right? I mean, they got together for a reason. And as Monica said, like, you tried, right? Like, you worked on that for a second. And then you realize, like, you can't do that anymore. And I think that there is so much shame because maybe you feel like you failed, but you didn't fail if you're leaving a relationship that is causing you harm. You are succeeding, you are thriving, you are doing so much better for yourself. So when you're talking about domestic violence and sexual assault too, I think we kind of leave that out of the conversation a little bit, but it's okay. Talk about it. Make it normal. Make it a normal part of your conversation. Like I do, it's part of my life. I work this, but I talk to my kids about red flags and domestic violence and sexual assault and whatnot. So just having that conversation, and then people will feel more open to come out and share their story. We had the Me Too movement several years ago, and we have other movements that have happened as well, and just giving the platform for people to be able to share, to make it, like, Monica, you're so brave right now because somebody out there is watching this who's like, I want to tell my story now. And you're giving them that platform. You're giving them that courage to do so. And so I think conversations like this help quite a bit to remove that stigma. But also, it doesn't matter why the victim stayed. It is, why is that person causing harm?
Yes. It's putting the onus on the person causing the harm,
yes,
versus the person that's staying, as if they're doing something wrong.
They're not doing anything wrong. They're just trying to make a relationship fix, but you can't fix that. You can't fix domestic violence.
And as you said, it's not black and white. Love is in there.
Right.
Love
and
makes
everything
everything shades of gray. Children, finances,
house. If you have a house together, your lives are intertwined. Absolutely
That's
intertwined.
What I was gonna say. It's incredibly challenging. I mean, statistically, a person takes between 7 and 10 times to leave a relationship. And as we talked about, it's most dangerous when somebody is trying to leave, when a protective order is served, when divorce papers are served, when custody papers are served. Because again, it goes back to that control piece. And it is challenging enough for two adult individuals to go through, but then you add in children, finances, house, family, right? Your extended family, your parents, your community, your animals.
Don't forget religion.
Right? Religion. Yeah. And so you as the victim or the survivor having to go up against all these things, and then sometimes even hearing from the people that you trust the most, no, that's not true, or they didn't mean it,
or he's such a good guy.
Yeah, but look, he bought you a purse, and so and that is invalidating.
Yes,
and so if we're having these conversations and we're talking about things that we need to name, and we need to use the terminology, and we need to use the compassion and the support, we also have to say, you know what, you're relevant, you matter, your voice is here and heard, and we're all here to help you. And be careful with questions, even though in your gut you're like, why didn't you just leave? Don't say it. Think it if you need to think it, but don't say it, because that in and of itself shuts down the relationship, and that's one less person that somebody in harm has in their trust circle, so to speak. So there's a lot of factors that go into why people stay. And so it becomes more challenging. It's a little bit like an onion, right? You have to go through all these levels of things that are connecting you to this individual.
And you often don't, like I said, it's unintentional many times. It's the, well, I wouldn't, and why didn't you? It's those things that make someone shut down.
Yeah.
And then, and the person is so worried about what everyone else thinks and is going to say and do, and on top of trying to figure out how to leave, and the children and the finances and all that, then you're concerned with your community and what are they going to think, and have to explain it. And oftentimes the abuser is a good person, because there's no one's just like all evil all the time. So there are good sides to this person, and maybe other people see that side and don't see the other part, so they're very clueless. But instead of, I guess it goes back to this whole idea of believing women in the first place. That's probably a whole
That's another discussion. That's another panel.
That's a whole nother discussion. But it goes back to believing women.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk a lot about guns.
Okay.
Guns were involved in 90% of domestic violence related homicides. Indiana's gun law changed, as we know, as of July 1. So you no longer need a permit to carry a handgun legally. and I put emphasis on legally, because that is one point that kept coming up over and over and over again at the State House. Legislators kept talking about legal carrying of a weapon, handgun. But there are several types of individuals who aren't allowed to carry a firearm. They include anyone who has been convicted of domestic violence, domestic battery, or criminal stalking, and a person restrained by a protective order. These people can legally own a firearm, but we know people who aren't allowed to carry a gun legally do so anyway. That's not new. How do you, and I'll start with you, Kelly, but I want to make sure that we kind of all speak on this. How do you think this new law will impact domestic violence and domestic violence related homicide?
So that's a great question, and it's something that I have spent a lot of time thinking about when this law was being presented in the State House. And I said earlier, I sit on the Domestic Violence Fatality Review team, and I will say that only one person, I've been on the review team for about 8 years now, only one person had their gun legally. So I'm not sure we're going to even see a difference. If you are a law-abiding citizen, you're going to be a law-abiding citizen, right? And if we had the permit and that all the stuff in place that we had in the past, like you're going to adhere to that. But if you're not a law-abiding citizen, you are going to buy a gun wherever you can or obtain it however you can for whatever reason you want. It's really easy to get a gun, and we have so many loopholes. You talked about the protective order for the Brady, but we have a girlfriend loophole. So if we never lived together, had children together, anything along those lines to make us an intimate couple, you cannot be Brady disqualified on a federal level.
I'm sorry, repeat that, please.
So if Jamie and I are dating, but we don't have a sexual relationship, we've never had children together, we never lived together, so it's just dating. We went out a couple of times, and Jamie is a lovely person and would never cause me harm, but let's pretend like she did.
So there was some stalking involved after a couple dates.
She would not be Brady disqualified because we were not in an intimate relationship.
Oh, I didn't realize it took sex to be in the mix.
It's that intimate part.
Yes.
It's the intimate piece.
It usually involves some kind of sexual relationship.
It does, yes.
But that's very specific. Mm-hmm. Okay. Wow.
And yeah, so I'm not sure that we're going to see a whole lot of difference with domestic violence. I mean, if you're causing domestic violence, you're not a law-abiding citizen. If you have, it makes it easier though, right, to get a gun. Mm-hmm. Like this is just such a hot topic because our Brady, there's no way to even run it. So if I have a protective order and I go and try to get a gun and they run my name through, the database, I might not even show up because we're not really great at putting that information in. So Our gun laws are awful. Our Brady laws are awful. And they're going backwards, but also at the same time, there's just so many guns out on the street anyway. It's so easy to get them. I've seen them on Facebook before. So the gun issue that could be a whole nother panel discussion too. But going along with guns, we do know that mass shootings, 60% of mass shootings start with domestic violence. So this is, if you're thinking, I want my guns, I'm a Second Right Amendment, that's fine. You can have your guns. I support that as long as you're a law-abiding citizen. But keep in mind that a lot of these mass shooters did legally obtain their guns. Mm-hmm. And they're killing their family members and then causing mass carnage in our communities. So it does impact and affect everyone.
And I think so much of that is missed in the conversation about guns. It's about, like you said, Second Amendment rights. I want to stay here for a bit because I wrote a column today that ran today talking about this this panel discussion we're having. And I received several emails from people who they brought up guns were used. I think oftentimes the idea, the image, especially what we see in movies, is often financial. I think of Sleeping with the Enemy, one of the when it was just, oh, he's just really controlling. There's this control element, and then the women become empowered and they have the guns. Or you think of Enough with Jennifer Lopez and fighting back. My first ever burning bed. But that the guns are used against women is not, or against people who are being abused, I should say, because it's not one gender or another. But that's not a big part of what we hear in the conversation surrounding domestic violence. Why do you think that is?
Are you asking anyone?
Just anyone.
Okay.
Sorry.
So I think that, first of all, if gun is present in the household, you have a 500% increased chance of being murdered by one, especially if domestic violence is in the household. I totally spaced your question. I'm so sorry.
Just why don't we hear more about guns?
About guns. Well, I think the Second
Amendment.
Amendment, people are afraid to talk about that. That is such a hot topic, right? To talk about the Second Amendment and gun regulation and that sort of thing. As a domestic violence advocate, I would like to see stricter and tighter gun laws, absolutely. But that turns people off completely. They're like, oh, don't take away my gun. I'm not going to take away your gun. I don't want to take away your gun. But we have to drive a car, you have to have a license, you have to go to school, like driver's ed, right? You have to pass the test, and then you have to have your car maintained in some states. So that's just to drive a car. Why can't we do something similar with guns? But people don't want to talk about it.
It's not in the Constitution.
No.
I also think the big thing here and the big sort of difference is we're talking about the legality, like the legal ownership versus the illegal ownership. And that's where the conversation needs to shift. And it's about, it's not about, I mean, ultimately it's about Second Amendment depending on who you talk to, but it's not necessarily about the people who are going out and getting their guns legally. Yes, that does need to be talked about for all the reasons that we that Kelly just highlighted, but it is also the plethora of illegal firearms that are out there, and how do we affect change there. But in terms of the general conversation, we do need to start talking about not only firearms, but also redefining what a weapon is, and redefining how items, objects, are used to hurt people. Guns are typically one of the most lethal, but other objects are used, pots and pans, phones, pens, and talking about how anything really can be an object used as a weapon, and talk more about the lethality level there. And I think as long as we're continuing to have conversations, and as long as we're continuing to name all of these things, and we're talking about the prevalence of domestic violence, the prevalence of firearm domestic violence homicides, and we continue to have these conversations, hopefully that will result in better awareness, better understanding, better definition, better clarity.
Hopefully.
And a safer environment for people.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Jamie, how can someone get a protective order? Is it difficult to obtain? Because as we heard from Monica's story, children were also involved, and often are, as you ladies brought up. How does that change the situation when it comes to leaving, when it comes to getting a protective order?
So a couple of things that I want to highlight. One of the things I want to say is there's two levels of protection. There's a protective order. That's a civil order, and that's the individual who needs protection applies for that. The second way to get protection under protective order laws is through a no contact order. And the no contact order is a criminal decision and typically that application is filed by the prosecutor, and it is designed to keep the defendant away from the witness, whoever the witness is and the defendant is, and that's generally the duration of the criminal case. So I want to make sure that everybody knows there's two different things here, and it's important because sometimes people say I have a protective order, and we find out that it's actually not a protective order, it's a no contact order. It's still something that is actionable, but a protective order is handled slightly differently. So in order to apply for or file a petition for a protective order, there's a bunch of different ways. There is an online portal now, so anyone can go onto the website and file a petition for a protective order. You can go into any number of the victim services providers and just request assistance with filing a protective order petition. And you can go to the Criminal Justice Center and head down there and also request one. What I will say is filing a protective order petition is a bit daunting if you haven't done it before. It is fairly easy to say yes when you meant to say no, because you may not understand what Brady is, for example.
What is Brady?
You want to give the legal definition of Brady?
I don't know the
We've
legal
mentioned
definition.
that a couple times.
It's the right to be able to carry a firearm.
Okay, Brady. Okay.
So if
Yeah,
you're Brady
so
disqualified, you no longer legally
no
can carry a
longer-
firearm.
Okay.
But the way the question is worded, you might not know what the correct answer is. Am I allowed to put my pets on my protective order? Do I have to file a different protective order for my children, even though I'm filing one? Are my children eligible? So there are all these questions. So my recommendation is that you reach out to somebody at a victim services provider to help you get through that application process. And then when the application or the petition is filed, it goes into the system. It goes to the prosecutor's office for service, and then served by the sheriff. And then if there's a hearing, there's kind of lots of different steps. And at any one of those steps, the process can be completely thwarted, it can be shut down, it can be denied, or it can be granted and extended. But it's a pretty challenging process to get through. The other piece of this is protective orders are really a tool. It's kind of a means to an end. As we heard from Monica's story, oftentimes we do have protective orders in place. We have no contact orders in place. It is challenging to get them violated. It is also sometimes challenging, frankly, to get them served, whether it's because we have, thousands of protective orders awaiting service, or we don't have an accurate address for someone. Maybe I dated them when they were living at such and such address, and that's the only address that I have, and then they moved, but I don't know that, then that service isn't possible. So there's a lot of different hurdles, unfortunately.
That's what I'm hearing, and my first question obviously is why? Why is it so hard to get a protective order, and why is it so confusing?
We don't know.
And maybe you know what? I'm asking the wrong people.
Well,
I'm putting this out there. Why is it so difficult, and why is it so confusing? Because how is this hurting? How is this helping people?
Sure. So I hate using the word or the term devil's advocate, but if it was really easy, everybody would have protective orders, and then it also then becomes ineffective, and we don't necessarily want that. However, that said, we need it to be
maybe less difficult?
Yes. And what I will tell you is that when you're working with an advocacy group or a victim services provider, we have all gone through extensive training on how to fill out the petition, what to help the survivors do. We are able to help with questions around Brady, those kinds of things, and it gives us the opportunity then to kind of keep an eye on what's going on. Is it in service? Has it been served? Is it waiting still? Do we have a hearing? Particularly if you're a survivor of domestic violence and you have fled, the likelihood is you're not in the same place that you were in when you filed the petition. And so now how do we let you know that you have a hearing coming up? So having an advocate kind of help through that allows for a little bit of ease in understanding what the petition looks like, what you need to include in it, and it also gives us an opportunity to follow up with you.
Do you have something you want to add, Monica? You look like you have thoughts.
A lot of them. When it comes to the protective order, I think, and I just know this from work standpoint because I'm a paralegal, the easiest way to get a protective order granted, I think, for victims, and this is what I tell people that I've come into contact with, is that when you are given that IP police report number, to include that in there.
Yes.
Just put it on there if you don't do anything else. The biggest issue, I think, after that is getting someone served with the protective order. I had a protective order granted for several months before he was ever served, and in fact he was never served with that until the criminal case came along and he was brought into custody, and then they served him with my civil protective order and a court order no contact order. The problem for victims is that, just like myself, and I know I'm not the only one, the police are not that interested in serving protective orders. I called the police several times, like, he's here, please serve him with a protective order, and they would tell me, call the civil sheriffs. That's their position. The police came into contact with him several times and still didn't serve him. I think that it's just really low on their priority list. Obviously there are other things happening, but more work needs to be done when it comes to those protective orders.
Because I know you're playing devil's advocate, but I'll play the devil's advocate as well, that this is a person's life, though. You know, so it's, yeah, if we make it easier, but we make so many other things easier.
Like getting a gun.
I was just thinking, you just mentioned getting a gun versus getting a license to drive a car. That's not, you know, we make certain things easier, we make other things more difficult. Yeah.
I don't disagree. I'm sorry. It does. I think the process needs to be easier. I agree with that. I think the application should be a little bit easier to understand. I think a lot, like I said, a lot of the questions sometimes you can answer yes when you mean to say no, and vice versa. I also think it also comes down to staffing. We need more people who are able to serve protective orders, who can help track down if somebody moved. You know, see if we can cross-run and find out if a different county knows that they showed up there, those kinds of things. And I don't know, that's not my, I don't work there, so I don't know exactly what's going on that side. But again, I think some of this is going to be having a lot of conversation around, okay, how do we get better? How do we do this differently? How are we more effective? And that's not just with protective orders or, you know, or gun laws or anything. I think that's just in general. How are we, as a community, how do we do better to serve individuals who are living in domestic violence situations? And you know, how do we wrap around all the services? And frankly, on both sides, right? On the batterers intervention side as well as on the survivor side, because we can't just focus on one without acknowledging that there needs to be focus on the other as well. So
and that's one of my questions coming, so we can spend a little time on the resources. You're jumping ahead of me.
I didn't mean to jump ahead.
That's okay. I do want to ask you, as we're talking, Kelly, if we're talking about people and guns and protective orders, how are people who are convicted of domestic violence held accountable? What needs to improve? So you laugh, like I figure that laugh is a lot of things. And I hear Monica saying
a loaded question. I will tread lightly. How about that?
Okay.
Our domestic violence prosecutors are completely overworked. Their caseloads are huge. That does not mean that every person should not have the individual, that's not what I'm saying, everybody should have a really good look at their case, absolutely, but there's just not enough staff. there's not enough people to go around and too many domestic violence cases to go around. So oftentimes, and just with our culture as a nation, I don't think we take domestic violence seriously enough when it comes to the courts. But also to counter that, I'm going to contradict myself completely. I know that, but
Okay.
we can't rely just on the courts either. We have to have the community hold people accountable. So if he goes to jail, which would be great, and probably will be like 30 days. We need more community accountability, and we need more prevention so this isn't happening to begin with. It's like, you need to be punished, but you're being punished on the back end. How do we stop that? How do we get in front of that so it's not happening at all to begin with?
It kind of goes back, well, it does go back to the education piece.
Yes.
To the way we talk about it, to realizing that it's happening more than what we think. Because it's kind of like we need to make this be a public health concern.
Absolutely. It is a
what
public
I'm
health
getting.
concern. It really is a public health concern because 40% of Indiana women have experienced domestic violence. That's probably a low number. That's just those that have reported. Because we know 1 in 3 women and 1 in 7 men, or 1 in 4. It depends on the statistics, but it's still very high. A third of all women experiencing domestic violence, and that's reported. And we also know with our youth too, they're under 18, they're experiencing teen dating violence. Before the age of 18, 1 in 3 girls are experiencing it, which means the boys are perpetrating it. So how do we get in front, or girls or whatever, the people, how do we get in front of them? And what does that look like? We can't keep relying on the criminal justice system to fix this issue, because it's not ever gonna fix it. It's a slap on the hand, and that's until you commit some horrendous offense.
It's really what I'm looking for. It's just kind of what's happening in the community. It's just a mirror. So if the community doesn't care, criminal justice system doesn't care much either. It's our priorities.
It is our priorities, and we have to care.
That's what it sounds like. It's our priority issue. It's not a high priority for us as a community, so therefore it's not a high priority for the criminal justice system. Monica, how would you like things to change with how domestic violence situations are handled?
Depends on where we're starting at. If we're starting with the prosecutor's office, they can certainly do a lot more. They need to hold abusers accountable. So, like in my case, in Crystal's case, in many other women's cases, we've had protective orders. We've had no contact orders. They have been continuously violated, and those charges have not been filed. Every single time a no contact order or an order of protection is violated, that can be a new charge. That means every phone call, every text message, every time your abuser has somebody else contact you, every time he pops up at your house, that can be a new charge. Oftentimes those charges are not getting filed, and they need to be. Especially when you have abusers threatening the victims. Sometimes it's not just, oh, I'm calling and I can't leave you alone and I'm so in love with you. Sometimes it's, I'm gonna kill you, I'm gonna shoot you, I'm gonna blow your house up, and things like that. It needs to be filed and prosecuted immediately.
That's heartbreaking. I want to spend the last little bit of the show focusing on resources, because we need to put out there. We've talked about, and really this hour is not enough. It's not enough. We're just barely scratching the surface of what we need to talk about. But Kelly, what resources are available to someone experiencing domestic violence? And are there programs for someone, you mentioned intervention, where can someone who wants to change, wants to do better, where can that person seek help?
Yeah, those are great questions. Resources, we have the Julian Center, we have Firefly, Salvation Army, Beacon of Hope. And if you go to dvnconnect.org, we list all the resources in Central Indiana. So that would probably be the best place to go, dvnconnect.org.
dvnconnect.org gives you a list of resources.
Of all of our resources in the city. But as you are navigating through that, just keep in mind, if shelter's full, there's hotel space. If you are facing an eviction, there's money available to help you circumvent that. Like, there's stuff out there that you might not even know is available right now until you call an advocate and discuss your situation. So once you call and you talk to somebody, they'll assess, what are your needs? Do you need food? Do you need clothing? Do you need emergency financial assistance? What is it? And then they'll connect you to those resources. Another great reason to connect with an advocate, really.
It sounds like the advocate is your first line after you do your Google search, or after you go to dvnconnect.org, you get an advocate. And that way, that person helps you figure it out.
Yes.
So you're not trying to figure it all out by yourself.
Because
you have so much going on. And you don't have to. And are there resources for someone who you mentioned intervention?
There are resources for those who harm others. It has a terrible name. It's called Batterers Intervention Program. You can be court ordered.
That's stuck in the 80s.
It is. You can be court ordered to a batterers intervention program if you have a domestic violence case, or you can self-refer. And they're very affordable. You do have to pay. That is part of being held accountable for the class or for your domestic violence. But also, I would say on top of that, hurt people hurt people.
Yes.
So you have trauma. If you are hurting someone, you're hurt. There's trauma in your soul, and you need to go to therapy.
And has education has education helped us to understand that it's not just this person is just, because we used to see this person in a way that was just very, very negative versus seeing this person as a person who is hurt. Has that changed over time?
I think it's slowly changing. Like, the movement is now, instead of using language such as batter, we're using language people who cause harm, because they are people first and foremost. They have lives, they have families. Maybe they don't actually want to do this. They just don't know anything better. I don't know. I'm not in their mindset, but sorry, go ahead.
I think, especially if you're talking about generational trauma too, like, this is how my parents raised me and their parents raised them. And, as parents, we think, okay, we're going to do these things better, right? We learn from our parents and we're like, okay, I'm going to do this better. And so I think the community conversations are taking those steps. But I said it earlier, and I've said it in community meetings, we on the victim services side will talk about this all day long, but that's only one half of it. And it's putting the responsibility squarely on the survivor to fix everything. And so the community conversations need to grow. They need to include resources for the folks who are causing the harm, the people who need the help on that side. I will say, so DVN provides services at the city level, and certainly you can go to the Julian Center website, which is juliancenter.org. But if you look at state coalitions, because I know we're on Facebook, so I don't know how far-reaching we are, but each of your state coalitions, ICADVinc.org is the Indiana coalition. They've got a list of resources that go beyond Marion County, and then the national network. And so the information is out there for both sides, for both the victim services as well as the batterers intervention side.
Now, I wanted to ask about one more thing, and our time is getting really short here, but another resource for grieving families who have been affected. I had a father who contacted me wanting this kind of information, and I thought, this is a part that I've never thought about, but where can grieving families are there support groups for grieving families? Or?
Yes. We have a wonderful, very hidden agency, I would say, in Indianapolis, called Legacy House. And they provide free counseling to victims of crime and trauma. So it might be a minute before he can get in, because they do have a wait list, but I would recommend Legacy House. And then for children, Brooks Place.
Thank you. Well, ladies, I want to thank you for joining me tonight. I learned so much. and I hope those listening did too. Again, it's not a pleasant conversation, but it's a much needed conversation, and having you was pleasant for sure.
Thanks.
So thank you very much, and good night.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.